The planes started going over at around 10 o'clock. You could hear them before you could see them, a low rumble that built into something that shook the windows of the small house on Warren Road, and then the sky was full of them. Hundreds of aircraft, moving in formation through the dark toward the English Channel, carrying thousands of paratroopers who would be behind enemy lines before the night was over. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had watched some of them leave. A few hours earlier, he had driven unannounced to Greenham Common Airfield in Newbury and walked among the men of the 101st Airborne Division, specifically the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, as they blackened their faces and checked their equipment and waited for the order to board. Before he left for that airfield, he had received a private briefing. Air Marshal Lee Mallory had warned him that the 101st Airborne could suffer up to 70 to 80% casualties in the jump. Eisenhower had listened to that number, and then he had gotten in his car anyway and driven to Newbury, because he needed to look at those men before they went. He moved through the crowd without ceremony, stopping here, asking a soldier where he was from, asking another what he did back home before all this. The men didn't always recognize him at first. When they did, some of them straightened up. He told them not to bother. He didn't stay long. He got back in his car and returned to the small house his staff called Telegraph Cottage. In Portsmouth, just 60 miles away, Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle and the senior commanders of every Allied nation were gathered. Eisenhower could have been there. He chose not to be. He preferred to wait alone. His driver, Captain K. Summersby, watched him that night. She later wrote that his eyes were bloodshot, that his hands shook slightly when he lit a cigarette, that he had the look of a man carrying something that couldn't be put down. At some point, the exact time isn't recorded, he sat down at a small table, picked up a pencil, and wrote a note on a slip of paper. It took less than a minute. He folded it once, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and didn't mention it to anyone. Then he gave the order that put 3 million people in motion. What he had written, and why he wrote it, is one of the most quietly remarkable things any American commander ever did, and almost no one knows it happened. Dwight Eisenhower was born in Denison, Texas in 1890 and grew up in Abilene, Kansas, the third of 7 sons, 6 of whom survived to adulthood, in a family that had very little money and a great deal of faith. His mother was a pacifist, a devout Mennonite. She wept when he told her he was going to West Point. She never entirely made peace with what her son had chosen to become, and he never entirely made peace with that either. Years later, when people asked him about the costs of war, he answered with a specificity that surprised them. He wasn't performing humility. He had grown up watching his mother pray, and some part of that never left him. He graduated from West Point in 1915 in the class that would later be called the class the stars fell on, because more generals came out of it than almost any other in American history. Of the 164 graduates that year, 59 would eventually reach general officer rank. He was not at the top of his class academically. He was not the most obvious candidate for greatness. He also never fired a shot in combat. When the United States entered the First World War, Eisenhower spent the entire conflict in the United States, training tank crews at a base in Pennsylvania. The war ended before he shipped out. He had prepared for a battle he never got to fight, and it bothered him for years. The sense that the men who had actually been in France had something he didn't, had seen something he hadn't, that there was a gap between his rank and his experience that he hadn't yet earned the right to close. By 1942, he had been a colonel for less than a year. By late 1942, he was commanding the Allied invasion of North Africa. He jumped over hundreds of more senior officers to get there. The men who were passed over were not always gracious about it, and the men who promoted him, Marshall, Roosevelt, were making a bet. They believed Eisenhower had something that couldn't be taught and wasn't always visible in the chain of command: the ability to hold together people who didn't like each other, to find the workable compromise between competing egos, to keep the coalition from tearing itself apart. Because that was the job, not battlefield tactics. There were plenty of people better than Eisenhower at battlefield tactics. The job was to manage Patton and Montgomery without losing either of them, to keep the British and the Americans pointed in the same direction, to absorb the political pressures from Washington and London and still somehow produce a plan that might actually work. He was not a brilliant general in the way that Patton was brilliant, or MacArthur. He was something rarer, a man who understood what the situation required and did not let his ego get in the way of it. But none of that had prepared him for what June 5, 1944, actually felt like. The invasion had already been postponed once. The original plan called for June 5th. The weather turned, a storm rolled in across the channel, the seas went rough, the cloud cover made accurate bombing impossible. Eisenhower sat in the conference room at Southwick House and listened to his meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, deliver forecasts that nobody wanted to hear. The assault was delayed 24 hours. That decision alone was almost unbearable. The troops were already loaded onto ships. They had been sitting in the harbors, sealed off from the outside world for days. They knew the invasion was coming, and they couldn't tell anyone. The longer they waited, the higher the chance that the Germans would find out. And there was another problem. The window for a successful landing required a specific combination of moon and tide that would not come again until late June. And by late June, the secrecy that had taken months to construct would almost certainly be gone. If D-Day didn't happen in the first week of June, it might not happen until 1945. And no one in that room wanted to think about what another year of war would cost. On the evening of June 4th, Stagg came back with a narrow opening. A break in the storm was coming. 36 to 48 hours of acceptable conditions beginning the morning of June 6th. The seas would still be rough. The cloud cover wouldn't be ideal, but it would be workable. Eisenhower sat quietly for a moment after the briefing ended. Then he looked around the room at his commanders, British, American, Canadian, and said, "Okay, we'll go." He was the only person in the room who had the authority to say it. He was also the only person in the room who would carry the full weight of it if it went wrong. He drove back to Telegraph Cottage that night and did not sleep. He paced. He smoked. He wrote letters to his wife Mamie that he would not send until after the landings, if he was still in a position to send them. Earlier that evening, before returning to Telegraph Cottage, he had driven to Greenham Common Airfield in Newbury. He had been told the 101st Airborne could suffer 70 to 80% casualties. He went anyway. He stood among men whose faces had been blackened with charcoal and cocoa, stepped over their packs and rifles, and asked them their names and where they were from. Texas, Michigan, Missouri. The states rolled on like a roll call. When he got back in his car and drove away, those standing nearby could see tears in his eyes. Somewhere around 10 in the evening, back at Telegraph Cottage, he walked outside and stood in the dark, listening to the planes. Then he went back inside and sat down at the table. He wrote it in pencil on a small notepad. It took less than a minute. The handwriting was hurried, so hurried that he wrote the date incorrectly, putting July 5th instead of June 5th. He never noticed. The note read, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." 53 words. He folded the paper once and put it in his shirt pocket. He did not show it to his chief of staff. He did not discuss it with his commanders. He did not tell Kay Summersby, who was still in the cottage and would later describe the anguish on his face that night. He just put it in his pocket. And then he signed the order that set D-Day in motion. Think about what that note represents. He was the supreme Allied commander of the largest military operation in human history. He had 4,000 ships at his disposal, 11,000 aircraft, nearly 3 million soldiers and sailors and airmen. He had the full weight of the United States and Britain and Canada and a dozen other nations behind him. He had been given more military authority than almost any American commander in history. And he sat alone in a small house the night before it all began and wrote down, for no audience, for no one, that if this failed, it would be his fault. Not the weather, not faulty intelligence, not the German defenses, not the complexity of the logistics or the unpredictability of the tides. His. He could have written nothing. Most commanders wouldn't have. He could have relied on the standard language of military failure. Unforeseen circumstances, enemy resistance exceeded projections, conditions did not permit. The language that spreads responsibility so thin no one has to carry it. He chose 3 words instead. Mine alone. The reports started coming in before dawn. The paratroopers had landed, not cleanly, not where they were supposed to, but they were on the ground and fighting. The naval bombardment had begun. The landing craft were in the water, moving toward the beaches. Then the reports from Omaha Beach started coming in. Omaha was the American sector, the most heavily defended stretch of the Normandy coastline. Cliffs rising from the water, machine gun nests dug into the high ground, German infantry who had survived the naval bombardment and were waiting. The first waves of Americans came in on the landing craft, and the ramps went down, and they walked into water that was chest deep, and the Germans opened fire. The casualties in the first hours at Omaha were catastrophic. Companies were cut to pieces before they reached the sand. Officers were dead. Sergeants were dead. Men huddled behind steel obstacles in the surf and tried not to drown and tried not to be shot, and many of them were both. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, looked at the reports from Omaha and came close to ordering a withdrawal. He later said he briefly considered redirecting the follow-up waves away from Omaha entirely, cutting the losses and trying something else. He didn't. His commanders on the ground didn't withdraw either. Small groups of men, some of them officers, many of them just privates who had run out of alternatives, began to move off the beach, up the bluffs, toward the German positions. They moved because there was nowhere else to go. By midday, the situation at Omaha had not been resolved, but it had stopped getting worse. By late afternoon, it had turned. By evening, 155,000 Allied troops were ashore and in control of 80 square miles of French coastline. D-Day had succeeded. Eisenhower spent most of that day in his command post receiving reports. He could not influence what was happening on the beaches. He had made his decision 36 hours earlier when he said, "We'll go." Everything that happened after that was in other people's hands. The men on the landing craft, the pilots overhead, the naval commanders timing the bombardment, the paratroopers still fighting in the dark fields of Normandy. He sat and waited and received reports and said very little. The note in his pocket got heavier as the hours passed, and then, slowly, lighter. A few days after D-Day, going through his pockets, Eisenhower found it. He read it again. 53 words, misdated by a month, written in a hurry in the dark while planes flew overhead. And the invasion it described as a failure had instead opened the door to the liberation of Europe. He crumpled it up, tossed it in a wastebasket. His aide, Captain Harry C. Butcher, retrieved it. He asked Eisenhower if he could keep it. Eisenhower was reluctant. He didn't particularly want the note to exist, let alone to be preserved. It was a private thing, a moment of accounting with himself that had never been intended for anyone else. But he said yes. The note was eventually donated to the National Archives. It now sits in the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, the same small town where he grew up, with no money and 6 brothers and a pacifist mother who wept when he chose West Point. You can read it there, in a glass case. 53 words in pencil on a small slip of paper, misdated by a month, written by a man who was too worried about what the next day would bring to notice what day it already was.
There is a tendency in the telling of military history to locate greatness in the spectacular, the bold maneuver, the stunning reversal, the last-minute charge. Patton driving through the night to relieve Bastogne, MacArthur waiting ashore at Leyte, Doolittle's planes lifting off an aircraft carrier toward Tokyo. Eisenhower's greatest moment was a note that no one was supposed to see. He could have distributed blame in that note, and it would have been entirely defensible. The weather had been genuinely unpredictable. The intelligence about German positions was incomplete. The logistical complexity of coordinating 4,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft and 3 million personnel left almost infinite room for error that was no one person's responsibility. He wrote none of that. He wrote, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." And he wrote it not for posterity, not for the history books, not for the press release that would have accompanied the announcement of failure. He wrote it for himself, because he was the kind of man who needed to know, going into something this large, that he had already settled the question of who was responsible. That is what the note actually is. It is not a performance of humility. It is a man deciding, before the outcome is known, that he will not hide behind circumstances if the circumstances go wrong. It is a man accepting that the authority he has been given comes with a weight that cannot be transferred to anyone else. Most people, given the choice, would not write that note. Most people, sent into something with those odds, would find a way to tell themselves that the failure, if it came, would be shared, situational, contextual, unavoidable. Would find a way to make themselves one factor among many rather than the central one. Eisenhower wrote it anyway, and then tucked it in his pocket and went to war. Eisenhower went on to become the 34th President of the United States. He served 2 terms, presided over a decade of relative prosperity, built the interstate highway system, and in his farewell address warned the American people about the dangerous influence of what he called the military-industrial complex, a speech that might be the most prescient thing any departing president has ever said. He is remembered for his smile, for the name Ike, for the sense of steady competence he projected through 8 years in the White House, and before that through 4 years of the most complex military command in American history. He is less often remembered for the man who stood in a dark airfield in England on the evening of June 5, 1944, and walked alone among men who were about to jump into the night over France. Men he had just been told might suffer 80% casualties. Who drove back to a small house and sat with a pencil and wrote down, in 53 words, the thing he was most afraid of. Who folded the paper once, put it in his pocket, and said nothing about it to anyone. He told his driver he hoped to God he was right. Then he gave the order. The note in his pocket was never needed, but the kind of man who writes it, before the battle, in the dark, for no audience, is exactly the kind of man you want giving the order. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. 53 words, written in pencil, misdated by a month, never meant to be read. The most important thing Dwight Eisenhower ever wrote.